I'm Ros Atkins. Welcome to Outside Source. Scientists here in London have begun human trials of a revolutionary vaccine against the coronavirus. A team at Imperial College are working at record speed. If it works, the vaccine could be mass-produced.
It means that we can make the equivalent of 2 million doses in the volume of a litre. So you imagine a litre bottle of lemonade, that would have 2 million doses in it.
As India reports 16,000 new cases of COVID-19 just in the last 24 hours, we'll get exclusive access to one intensive care unit in one of Mumbai's top hospitals. More than 100,000 people have now died from COVID-19 in Latin America, with over half of those deaths in Brazil. We'll give you a full update on that. A US appeals court has ordered the federal judge to drop the criminal case against President Trump's former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. Well, as we've discussed before on Outside Source, there's only one guaranteed way to get out of this coronavirus pandemic, and that's a vaccine. And the BBC has been given exclusive access to human trials of a vaccine being developed by scientists at Imperial College in London. Their approach has never been tried before, and it uses only a tiny dose. If the trials work, the researchers say they should have enough vaccine available to immunise 40 million people in the UK by the middle of next year. Here's our medical correspondent, Fergus Walsh.
Coronavirus has transformed all our lives, and although restrictions are easing, there's only one certain way out of the pandemic, one way to protect us all from the virus, to return society to normal, and that's a vaccine. Never has science responded so fast to a global health threat. What usually takes years has been done in months. There are now more than 120 coronavirus vaccines in early development. 13 have begun human trials, 5 in China, 3 in the United States, 2 in the UK, and 1 each in Australia, Germany and Russia. We'll need several to work if there's to be enough doses to protect 7 billion people on the planet. After Oxford University, now Imperial College London is the latest to begin trials. Kathy, who's 39, is one of 300 volunteers who'll receive the Imperial vaccine. She'll get a second booster dose in 4 weeks. Why did you volunteer?
I think it came from not really knowing what I could do to help, and this turned out to be something that I could do, and understanding that it's not likely that things will get back to normal until there is a vaccine, so wanting to be part of that progress as well.
If the safety trial goes well, a further 6,000 volunteers will be immunised in the autumn. Trials might also need to happen overseas, in virus hotspots, because that's the only way researchers will know for sure if it offers protection.
I wouldn't be working on this trial if I didn't feel cautiously optimistic that we will see great immune responses in our participants. But there's still a long way to go to evaluate this vaccine.
This is a really unusual vaccine. The synthetic genetic code it contains should instruct muscle cells to produce the spike protein found on the surface of coronavirus. That should prompt the creation of antibodies. And that army of antibodies should remain on guard in case of future exposure to coronavirus. And if it works, prevent infection. Because it's all created artificially, with no need to grow any virus, the vaccine can be manufactured on a huge and concentrated scale.
It means that we can make the equivalent of 2 million doses in the volume of a litre. So you imagine a litre bottle of lemonade, that would have 2 million doses in it. So when you want to start making vaccine for the world, if this is successful, and that's still a big if, it makes it so much more tractable because you don't have to build a factory the size of several warehouses.
Imperial College say they could have enough doses ready to immunise 40 million people in the UK by next summer. But trials must first show the vaccine is safe and effective. Fergus Walsh, BBC News.
Well, while we await a vaccine and lockdowns start to lift in a number of countries around the world, the number of new cases of this virus continues to rise. Here's the latest warning from the World Health Organization.
We expect to reach a total of 10 million cases within the next week. This is a sober reminder that even as we continue research into vaccines and therapeutics, we have an urgent responsibility to do everything we can with the tools we have now to suppress transmission and save lives.
And while the wait for a vaccine goes on, the fear of a second wave of coronavirus infections is very real. Today in the UK, health experts have urged ministers to carry out a review to make sure the UK would be ready if a second wave were to arrive. In this letter, published in the British Medical Journal, they say the available evidence indicates that local flare-ups are increasingly likely and a second wave a real risk. Well, here's more on why they want a review.
We still don't have an answer as to why my colleagues from the Black, Asian, minority ethnic groups are more likely to die from this illness. These are all things that urgently need looking into in a no-blame, forward-looking way so that we can be prepared and put measures in for a potential second wave in October and the winter.
And here's the BBC Science editor David Shookman on the latest figures here in the UK.
So what's the state of the virus right now? Well, things have definitely been going in the right direction. This line is a rolling 7-day average of new infections across the UK, far lower now than it was at the peak back in April. But let's compare that to the rest of Europe. In the UK, we're getting about 1,000 new infections every day. Germany, France, Italy, Spain, all getting far fewer. Again, this is a one-week average for the numbers, and that gives them a much better chance to tackle any new outbreaks.
Now, we wanted to be clear as we could be when we say a second wave. What do we mean? Well, it's not as easy as you might think, as there's no formal definition. One academic told the BBC it's not particularly scientific. How you define a wave is arbitrary. But generally, in order to say one wave has ended, you would expect to see the virus under control and cases to have fallen substantially. For a second wave to start, then you would need a sustained rise in infections. So New Zealand, which has had its first cases after 24 days without any, and Beijing, which is facing an outbreak after 50 virus-free days, are not in that position yet. But some scientists would argue Iran may be starting to meet the criteria for a second wave, though, of course, you won't hear that from the Iranian government. Here's Rana Raimpour from BBC Persian.
We can see a difference. So for a period of a couple of weeks, the deaths went to below 100 every day, which is probably a result of a few weeks lockdown around March, around the Iranian New Year. But it's going up, and we now have more and more cases. So today, for instance, we had 2,500 confirmed cases and 120 deaths. So it is definitely going up, but for some reasons that are unknown to us, the officials are refusing to call it a second wave. We know that the Iranian President Hassan Rouhani has said that we don't want to create fear among people, and it's important to know that Iran, under sanctions and under huge systematic corruption, is running out of money, so they really can't support people, and they are not in a position to reintroduce a lockdown. Also, on another development, the BBC Persian service has done a research about the excess deaths that have been announced only for winter. And it seems that the confirmed deaths is probably 5 times less than the actual numbers. It seems that during that period, more than 6,000 excess deaths were reported. And it seems that the number of deaths is probably way more than what the official numbers are.
So that's a view of the situation in Iran. Elsewhere, we're not seeing anything on the scale that could be described as a second wave, but we're definitely seeing local outbreaks. Here's one example. In the German state of North Rhine-Westphalia, lockdown restrictions have been reimposed in 2 districts because of a spike in cases. More than 500,000 people will now be affected by that. One area is home to a meat packing plant where more than 1,500 workers have tested positive. For more from Germany, here's Damien McGuinness.
Just as life in Germany feels like it's getting back to normal, people here have been thrown back into lockdown and the whole region is being tested.
It is a catastrophe, I think, and we see it here in Gütersloh. I only hope that the working conditions are being improved for the workers.
7,000 workers from Germany's largest meat processing plant are in quarantine after more than 1,500 employees tested positive with the virus. They're getting supplies and the army has been drafted in to help. but police are ensuring people comply with force if necessary. Many of the employees are poorly paid seasonal migrant workers from Eastern Europe. Some don't speak German and feel like they're being locked up. Tönnies is the largest meat processing plant in Germany, a family firm run by billionaire Clement Tönnies, known here as the Meat Baron. He's accused of causing the outbreak through poor working conditions and cramped accommodation. But meat processing plants and abattoirs all over the world have been hit by coronavirus outbreaks. Scientists say they are particularly susceptible.
Physical factors like low temperature, moisture, people are working very closely together. There's no way they can keep the distance of 2 meters. It's noisy, so they have to shout if they want to talk to each other. But also there are often crowded living conditions because the people who are coming there, many of them are migrants.
The region's political leaders are also under fire for not acting quickly enough. But overall, Germany's national infection rates remain low. And officials say so far localised outbreaks have been contained. So there's no evidence yet of a second wave. Damien McGuinness, BBC News, Berlin.
Now, for all these reasons, we can understand why countries are wary of going too fast too soon. For example, EU ambassadors met today to discuss how to reopen their borders from the 1st of July. There have been some reports that travellers from the US will not be allowed in. We'll have to see if that comes to pass. This graph from the Washington Post may help to explain why some are advocating that measure. It compares the number of new cases in the US and the EU, and as you can see, they've dropped off much, much more sharply in the European Union than they have in the United States. Well, in the end, those EU ambassadors didn't reach a consensus. They will continue their talks on Friday, so we await a decision on when and how those borders will be opened. As you can see, a similar idea is actually already playing out within the US. The states of New York, New Jersey and Connecticut have announced a 14-day quarantine for people entering from other American states with high infection rates. So New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, alongside his fellow governors, announced the domestic travel advisory, which says these restrictions are in place on the states of Alabama, Arkansas, Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina, Washington, D.C., Utah and Texas. Ultimately, though, this is a global problem and the WHO is doing its best to guide the world through it. Here's its latest warning.
We have been able to show in Western Europe with a lot of effort that we can slow the spread. But we are not, as a world, on top of this pandemic. It's really very much with us, and it will be with us for months, perhaps even years to come.
Well, let's turn back to the United States. Completely different story, unrelated to COVID-19. Here's a tweet from President Trump saying, "Great. Appeals Court upholds Justice Department's request to drop criminal case against General Michael Flynn." Now, this is about the President's former National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn. He was fired after 22 days in the gig for lying about his contacts with Russians. He later pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI. He then asked to withdraw his guilty plea and the case was handed to a district judge. Now, this new ruling effectively ends the case. To help me explain this further, here's Gary O'Donoghue in Washington.
His critics will say that he intervened in this case, that in fact he's already said he specifically intervened because he thought the original sentence was a bit harsh, or the prosecution was a bit harsh. And of course the President has tweeted repeatedly and spoken repeatedly about Michael Flynn's case. And then last month the Attorney General announced a review that he ordered of the Flynn investigation by an outside attorney from a different jurisdiction, and that concluded, he said, that the prosecution and the way Flynn had been questioned at the time by the FBI just after Donald Trump took office, that questioning was illegitimate and wasn't necessary, and therefore the lies he told in a sense were irrelevant. And that's the basis on which the DOJ pressed for the dropping of the case. Bear in mind, Michael Flynn was actually the only person in the Trump administration who faced any kind of prosecution as a result of the Mueller investigation.
Now, in a few minutes on the programme, we're going to talk about COVID-19 once more, because more than 100,000 people have died across Latin America. We're going to look at the different experiences of a number of countries with the help of our colleagues in Miami. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has announced her plan to ease coronavirus restrictions, allowing for parts of the Scottish economy to reopen if progress continues in controlling the virus.
I can confirm that on the 3rd of July, it is our intention to lift the guidance advising people in Scotland to travel no more than 5 miles for leisure and recreation purposes. And although the tourism sector will not open fully until the 15th of July, we intend that self-contained holiday accommodation, for example, holiday cottages and lodges or caravans where there are no shared services, can open from the 3rd of July. However, we would ask people to use good judgment, abide by the rules that apply at any time to households meeting up, and be sensitive to those living in our rural and island communities. And the advice, of course, remains to avoid crowded places. As we hopefully suppress the virus further, we will also continue to consider any measures that might be necessary to protect against the risk of imported cases of the virus.
I'm Ros Atkins with Outside Source. We're here in the BBC Newsroom. Our lead story is that scientists at Imperial College in London have begun human trials of a revolutionary vaccine against COVID-19. Now let's talk about Kosovo, because its president, Hashim Thaçi, has been charged with war crimes by a court investigating Kosovo's independence war with Serbia in the 1990s. A statement from a prosecutor of the Kosovo Specialist Chambers in The Hague said Mr Thaçi and other suspects were criminally responsible for nearly 100 murders. Other charges include enforced disappearance, persecution and torture. More than 10,000 people were killed during the independence war, which ended after a 78-day NATO air campaign. Now, while many countries are focused on preventing a second wave of COVID-19, others are still very much struggling with the first one. I'm going to bring you updates now from across Latin America, but we'll start with an update from India because cases there are surging. The latest daily tally is over 16,000 new infections. That's the highest figure yet. In total, nearly 500,000 people have been infected. That's the 4th highest in the world. And over 14,000 people have died, over 400 in the last 24 hours. Now, the majority of these cases are in 3 states, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu and New Delhi. There's a particular focus on the capital, Delhi. A quarter of all new cases in India are there at the moment. We've seen buildings being transformed into makeshift hospitals. For example, this used to be a spiritual centre. Now it's a COVID isolation facility with a capacity for 10,000 patients. Here's more from Yogita Lamai.
There is increasing alarm about the rising number of coronavirus cases, particularly in the national capital. In response, the government of Delhi has said that they will screen every single home in the city by the 6th of July. What this means is that people will be going door to people's homes. They will be screening if anyone has coronavirus symptoms like fever or a cough. In other parts of the country as well, the southern city of Chennai, for example, a lockdown was reimposed a few days ago because of the rising number of cases.
So we talked about Delhi. We'll turn to Mumbai, though. It's the worst affected city in India. It has more than 60,000 infections, and of course, that's putting immense strain on its hospitals. The BBC's Maharesh Konur has been given access to an intensive care unit in the King Edward Memorial Hospital, one of Mumbai's best-known hospitals, and here's what he saw.
These are the 15% with serious symptoms. The ward is calm and quiet. With relatives in quarantine, patients in the unit are alone. The doctors here are their only link to the outside world.
The family of the patients cannot be here. They don't even know what is the exact condition of their family member inside the ICU. This has increased mental stress for both patients and us. Because we meet the patients every day. We become their only immediate contact.
But it's not just the patients who have the virus. Dr. Vajpayee and her family of 9, including her 1-year-old twins, have all had it too. She got infected in April.
I came to know during our screening that I was positive.
Since last several hours, there is no staff nurse in this ward.
Many doctors have struggled to cope. In another part of the same hospital, feeling overwhelmed and understaffed, resident doctors have been filming the wards and posting videos on social media.
I am feeling helpless right now.
I can't do anything. I can't let person die in front of my eyes.
Extra staff have been brought in to help the doctors since the video was made public. But their boss says scenes like these are common in state-run hospitals like these.
When you say our hospital is crowded and one bed is shared by 2 patients, then you will find such situation in private hospitals as well.
The monsoon season is just beginning in Mumbai, and that means the health workers are now faced with 2 challenges: treating seasonal infectious diseases such as malaria and dengue, and fighting the virus.
Well, from India to Latin America, which is under pressure too, combined with the Caribbean, deaths from the virus have now passed 100,000, and we're told the virus has not even peaked in that part of the world. Here's the WHO.
We've seen a steady and worrying continuation of trend, with many countries experiencing between 25 and 50% rise in cases over the last week, which means many countries in Central and South America and in the Americas in general are still suffering sustained community transmission.
We've talked a lot about Brazil. Deaths there account for nearly half of all the fatalities in Latin America. These latest pictures detail the stark reality of what's happening there. These are row after row of new graves being dug in Rio de Janeiro. Over the last 4 months, there have been over 1 million confirmed cases in Brazil. Mexico, too, is being badly affected. It has over 190,000 cases and over 23,000 deaths. It also has a low rate of testing, which means that the figure may well be higher. And there are other challenges, too. This hospital in Mexico City had to be evacuated when a powerful earthquake struck on Tuesday. Also wanted to mention these triplets. They're only 3 days old. The babies, 1 girl and 2 boys, were tested for the virus within 4 hours of being born in San Luis Potosi state. Their tests came back positive. What's puzzling their doctors is that both their parents' tests came back negative. While 2 of the babies are in a stable condition, 1 of them's being treated for a respiratory condition. I'll speak to Rafael Rojas from BBC Monitoring, live with us from Miami. Rafael, let's talk about Mexico first. Help me understand what its strategy is to take on the amount of pressure being exerted by the virus.
The situation in Mexico continues to be the situation that began when the pandemic hit the country. The Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, has continued insisting that Mexico has already peaked in the number of cases, even though the number of deaths, as you were initially saying, has climbed to over 23,000. The government insists that the situation is not as dire as the media is playing it out to be.
Also want to ask you about Chile. We've talked a lot about Mexico, Brazil and Peru in the last few days, less so about Chile. Tell me what's happening there, please.
So Chile has currently over 250,000 cases, over 4,700 deaths, and the situation there continues to be problematic because the numbers are rising. The government is trying to keep under control the situation. But in Chile, as in Peru, there is one big problem that analysts find, and it has to do with job informality. People have to go out of their houses to the streets to find food, to find money, to provide for their families, something that the government has been unable. The governments in Peru and Chile have been unable to grapple.
And given the different problems across the region, I wonder, is there any regional coordination, or does each country make its own decisions about this virus?
So far, there has been cooperation between certain countries. Of course, the political situation between several of those nations, being the left-wing government of Venezuela or the right-wing government of Brazil, has complicated matters to such an extent that the border between Venezuela, Brazil, Colombia, and Peru has been one of the most affected places because of this coronavirus.
And lastly, I must ask you about Brazil. The figures are incredibly shocking at the moment. BBC Monitoring focuses on media coverage that we see in different countries. How is the media treating this story in terms of President Bolsonaro?
The media has been increasingly critical of Bolsonaro, even from the beginning of his mandate. But the coronavirus crisis and his refusal to acknowledge that there is a problem, the situation in which the 2 people who have been responsible for the response of the coronavirus crisis have been sacked, that situation in the media has played out with intense criticism, and it's very difficult to find a media outlet that defends Bolsonaro's position.
Rafael, thank you very much indeed. We're always indebted to our colleagues at BBC Monitoring for helping us report this pandemic in its many different forms around the world. Remember, if you want additional information, whether it's on Fergus's research into that new vaccine that's being trialled, or updates on the situation in Latin America or India, you can find all of these things through the BBC News website. It's bbc.com/news. And if you have a smartphone and don't have the BBC News app, whether you have an Android or an Apple, you can download the BBC News app via your App Store and onto your smartphone. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.